So Anne told me the theme today was about friends, and so this is a story of Joe and his best friend. When they were young, they moved into farms that were adjacent to each other. They could see each other's houses across the field, and at night when the lights were on, it was kind of comforting to know that there was somebody near. Well, soon after they moved into their farms, they brought their young wives to live with them. And the wives became the best of friends. Living on a farm was hard work, but they shared the work. The gentleman would bring up a big bucket of cream-laden milk, and those ladies would churn butter. They would turn the crank on the butter churn, and the wooden paddles would go round and round, and they turned and turned, and ultimately little chunks of butter started to congeal in the milk. And ultimately, they had a big wad of butter, enough to last them for a whole week. They baked bread together too. They had a sourdough starter that they kept in a cool place. They'd pull some of that sourdough starter off and make loaf of bread. They'd baked every day. It was a good place for that butter to end up. Farming was really hard back then. These ladies grew all of their vegetables for their family. And speaking of families, these women were such good friends. One day, Joe's wife came to him and announced that they were going to have a baby. Within the next week, Joe's neighbor's wife made the same announcement. So 9 months later, they each had little baby girls. And this went on every 2 years until these families had 3 children each. Now, when the kids got to be in school and had friends down the road, there was a tradition that Joe's wife dreamed up. At the end of the tomato growing season, she would invite all the children to come to the farm. And she gave instructions to their mother, have them dress in the most ragged clothes, something you wouldn't mind throwing away, but come to the farm tomorrow. She taught the kids how to figure out what tomatoes were still good to be able to can, and they carefully collected those. But the tomatoes that were so slimy and ripe they just fell apart in a handful of seeds, this is where it's going to become fun. Once they had all the good tomatoes placed aside, they had the biggest tomato fight you have ever seen. It was horrible. They had such fun. They giggled and laughed and rolled around. They were a mess, but they had a good time. The gentlemen would do the hard labor on the farm. They would cut the hay and milk the cows, and they kept their bulls in separate pens, but the cows and their calves were able to roam the green fields because the cows all knew whose barn to go home to at night. It was a wonderful life. That farming life was the best way to raise children. But ultimately, the children finished school and went off to their lives. They left the farm, and so here we have Joe and his neighbor and their wives. Now, the wives were really good friends, and they got into doing these things like quilting. They would get the neighborhood people together, and they would make these big, beautiful quilts together. They were wonderful. Excuse me, I've got allergies to chrysanthemums. They would...
We got those just for you.
They worked really, really hard on the farm all those years together. Well, one day, Joe's neighbor's wife grew ill, and by that winter, she had passed on. They had been such good friends, and by the next spring, his wife went to her reward. Now it was just Joe and his best friend. Well, one day Joe is over at his friend's farm looking around, and he sees this calf walking through the green field, and he goes, "That's my calf." And his neighbor was kind of taken aback. He thought that Joe was saying that he had stolen that calf. They got into this huge argument, and the wives weren't there to intervene anymore. And they were both very stubborn men. They got in this argument, they stomped to their houses, they slammed their doors, and that was it. They didn't see each other for a week. Joe was starting to feel kind of poorly. And then there came a knock on the door. And for a minute, Joe's heart raced because he thought maybe that was his neighbor. But when he opened the door, there was this pleasant-looking man. And at this man's feet was a big wooden box full of beautiful carpentry tools. Those original carpentry tools that were works of art. Planes and saws and miter boxes, this whole box full of tools. And the man said to Joe, "Do you have any carpentry projects I can do for you?" And Joe said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I do. Come with me." And he walked over toward his neighbor's house, and halfway between the houses, right where the property line was, he pointed out to the carpenter, "You see this? My neighbor dug this big trench, this great big ditch, and then he released the upper pond into it, and now we have this big rushing stream between us. Out by the barn, there's a stack of wood. Would you build me a fence so tall I not only cannot see his house, but I can't see this awful ditch either?" So Joe had to go to town for supplies, and he hitched up the wagon and he went to town. And the carpenter got busy. He knew he had to finish by the time Joe got home that night. He brought the wood around. He sawed and measured and hammered, and measured and sawed and hammered, and worked all day right through lunch. And then at sunset, Joe came driving home. And Joe sees not a fence, but a bridge across that ditch. And coming across the bridge was his neighbor with his hand out saying, "Joe, I missed you so much. Take that calf, take that calf. It's got to be yours." And Joe said, "No, you keep that calf. I am so happy that we are back together again." And as they were shaking hands and embracing, the carpenter picked up his tools and started down the lane. And Joe and his neighbor said, "Wait, we have projects. We can give you projects to do." And the carpenter said, "No, I have other bridges to build."